Welcome back to Eye on the Money, and today on the show we're discussing the social impact of the pandemic on domestic workers 1 year later on, and we're making reference to a Sweep South report that did investigations on the same. And joining me on the show is Aisha Pandor, who is the CEO and founder of Sweep South. Now, Aisha, before we took a break, you were really talking to us about the key findings. The pandemic has obviously had a dramatic impact on domestic workers in terms of their earnings, in terms of there's increased debt, there's just in terms of livelihoods, the impact has been fully felt. But you were talking to us about when it comes to remedies, there's a need to look at the existing policies and regulation around domestic work. So I'd like us to dwell a bit on that. First of all, is there policies and regulations in place? What do those look like? And in light of what your findings are and everything that's actually on the ground, how then can this be enforced or even strengthened to make sure that they meet what they're supposed to meet and protect the domestic workers?
Sure. So I think, first of all, we fortunately do in South Africa and Kenya have legislation which caters to domestic workers. Nigeria currently doesn't when it comes to minimum wage, for example. And I think this can be incredibly helpful in mandating both the minimum, absolute minimum, and I think it's important to say that the minimum isn't the goal. So it's, the floor that domestic workers should be paid. In addition, though, to payment, there should be legislation that caters to other conditions for domestic workers. So in South Africa, we have a sectoral determination, a specific piece of law that caters to domestic workers, bearing in mind the historical and continued global exploitation of domestic workers. And this is sort of best practice in our view. So legislation which looks at what are the basic conditions that workers like domestic workers can expect from their employers. And this is particularly important because as part of the survey, we also looked at abuse in the workplace and looked at reports of physical, verbal, and sexual abuse, and found that they're particularly high amongst domestic workers in all of the 3 countries surveyed.
Now, Aisha, considering we're looking at the impact of the pandemic, and you rightfully said that in comparison to the findings last year to this year, there's a bit of improvement. It might not be much, but we're seeing a bit of bounce back from some families. But the truth is the pandemic is still here with us. We're seeing certain countries going to even more lockdowns, certain countries exercising even more stringent measures. The vaccine rollout is currently in progress, but it's also experiencing some sort of resistance and bottlenecks. So with that reality, what would you say, what does the future look like, and where do the remedies lie? Are we going to get to a situation where, the next survey you do, the results are much better, and to get to that point, what do we need to do?
I think a lot of it really depends on the recovery post the pandemic, which depends very much on vaccine rollout. So again, encouraging to see that either vaccinations or the willingness to take vaccinations was much higher from Kenyan respondents than South Africans and Nigerians. And I think it's important to try and combat any potential myths and stigma when it comes to those vaccines, because ultimately once vaccines are rolled out, economies can open up, and it means that not only can domestic workers go back to work, but it also means that their employers, so the private employers, the customers on platforms like Sweep South who are paying for their services, are able to earn an income, are able to go back to work. I think it's important to remember that domestic workers are workers who are paid out of a subset of a household's earnings. And this makes it different from, someone who's employed by a corporation, for example. Domestic workers' earnings depend on household earnings. And so if you have a household where, employers are impacted, where they're retrenched, where they have their own salaries reduced, or they're not able to go back to work, that's going to have a circular impact on domestic workers as well. So this really, really just depends on, vaccine rollout, so the ability to deliver vaccines to as many people as possible, and combating the stigma around vaccines. And so that's not just the work of government, that's the work of community organizations, religious leaders, neighborhood groups, community groups, employers of domestic workers, to really try and be part of this movement to make sure that we take an educational approach to vaccines and make sure that as many people as possible are comfortable with taking them when they are available.
Finally, Aisha, before I let you go, I don't think we can have this conversation without talking about the impact that this pandemic has overall had on people's mental health. What were the key highlights when it came to that, considering we know with dwindling incomes, with uncertainty, with failing to meet your basic cost of living, that will obviously take a toll on anyone's mental health. So what would you say are the key findings to that? And you know, with mental health things, there's a very big conversation around that right now, and also maybe in the short term, even with the realities, what can be done to maybe address this?
Thank you for bringing it up because it's such a key issue. I think we really underestimate the mental health impacts of this pandemic, which doesn't just have economic impacts, but which also has medical impacts. People, dealing with questions around their own health, family members' health, having family members pass away, on top of all of the other impacts. So, very, very important question, and something that we surveyed as part of the report. We found that 1 in 5 respondents had reported mental health issues as a result of the pandemic and the impacts of the pandemic. 12% of those getting a formal diagnosis, and by far the most people saying that they were suffering from depression and then anxiety. And when we looked at the causes behind this, they reported that it's unemployment, it's loss of earnings or being highly in debt, and just really feeling helpless about that situation and not feeling like they were able to deal with it from a mental health point of view. So part of the recommendations have been to, as part of public health systems across the continent, also be really aware of mental health needs and making sure that as much as we make clinics available to look at physical health, we're also aware of the mental health, the trauma aspects of this pandemic, and are able to counsel people effectively.
Aisha, thank you so much, and also for the brilliant work that you're doing. Those were very great insights into the survey. For anyone who's interested, our audience will be willing to share that. But remember, you can also reach us on our social media handles. Aisha, thank you very much. At this point, I'll let you go because unfortunately we're out of time, and that's all we had for you today on Eye on the Money. Keep the conversation going at Metropol TV KE, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Enjoy the rest of your viewing.